The last speaker is someone I've been friends and known for many, many years. Peter Fenwick is a neuropsychologist and psychiatrist at King's College, Goldsmiths College in London, and he will speak on EEG and fMRI studies on the transmission of subjective light energy between a meditation teacher and his pupil. Peter.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to thank Stuart and the committee for inviting me, as everybody has, but I'd also like to thank the audience, those wonderful people who have come here to share their knowledge with the conference. Fantastic. So, to the audience. It used to be, when I was an intern, fashionable to go to America. And this was always known as getting your BTA. Now, in consciousness research, of course, it's no longer a BTA, it's a BTT. And so I'm pleased to have got my Been to Tucson certificate. I'm going to talk about a really interesting phenomenon that I thought that I ought to investigate. And this was a person who could give light. Now, his name is Alain Forget. He is a French philosopher. And if you sit in front of him in this rather stereotyped cartoon, you can see light. You actually can also feel energy. So what is this light that you can see? Is this something which comes out of him? Is it self-generated? What exactly is it? So there are a number of questions which I thought needed answering. And so I'm going to tell you about what we found when we started examining the question. So the first question is, what are the light phenomena? What brain, EEG, and MRI changes occur when light is being given? A, in the teacher, and then also, most important, B, in the students. What are the brain interactions between the teacher and the student? And what are the long-term effects of receiving the light? And what is this light? Is it there at all? Perhaps it's imagination. So these were our questions, and we thought that we ought to study it. Now, light phenomena is, in fact, very common. We don't normally think of it, and the situations in which it occurs, we don't actually talk about it very much. One of these, of course, is at the time of death. So there's a long history of association, meditation, spiritual experience, and death. In fact, this is in the crypt of St. Francis at Assisi, when his fellow priests used to see him rushing across the sky in a chariot of light. It was a very nice, pretty picture. Do you see light now in meditative states? Indeed, you do, and there's some very nice papers on this, which I would recommend. This is Buddhist meditation, strings of light, globules of light, colored jewels, lights in rays spreading out, and radiant light. Now, most of these are all internal. This is another study, and it just shows you the sort of quality that it has. I was just bursting with light. I just closed my eyes, and it was just brilliant light. I just felt like I was radiating, like the rays of light coming out of me. It felt like it was just emanating from my body and my system. But this wasn't my entire retreat. It came at the end. So long Buddhist retreats can obviously produce the experience of very strong light. But it's not only there. You see light at the time of death. Now, when I talk about seeing light at the time of death, it's not what the death report, although in fact they do. 80% of people, between 60 and 80%, have transcendent experiences as they come up to die. A nice paper on that from Switzerland. It's radiant light in the room. It's white light surrounding the patient as they died. It's transfiguring light over the patient, either white or gold. Globules of light in the room at the time of death, and sources of light not electric light, which go out when the patient takes their last breath. So light is, in fact, very common. As I say, we just don't discuss it. So what I'm going to do is now to go on to look at this teacher. His name is Alain Forget. He's a philosopher. He's age 65, and he's French. And he's written a book, How to Get Out of This World Alive. And there's some copies of the book there if any of you want them, and they're free. So, CV, born to a French landowning family. He came to the UK when he was 16, 18. He went to Australia, returned to France. No higher education, which is important. Spent up to the age of 50 studying the mystics and sitting in silence in cathedrals. Then he had 2 awakenings, which I'm using in the classical sense, of moving into a different spiritual dimension. An ability to give light started in 1995. Now, when people go to see him, he estimates, and he says he's seen 6,000 people, that about 50% of novices can see the light. So we won't all see it, but many do. This actually goes back to what happens at the time of death. Some siblings surrounding the person who's dying see the light, whereas other siblings don't. So there is very much an independent personal component. So the subjective experiences of seeing Alan's light, or the teacher's light, it's white and colored light seen surrounding him, very strong light in the room, changes in the density of the air in the room, which becomes colored, often purple, light forms like globules or sparkles, colors on Alan, on his hands and face, and those who've been with him for a longish time develop the siddhis. Siddhis are special experiences which you have if you've been meditating for some time, certain in the Buddhist tradition. And the siddhis that I've seen developed are that they can, in fact, develop the capacity to see light, colors on people. And the colors are intuitive, so there is an intuitive component which has changed, there's a perceptual component which has changed. And it gives you a lot of information about the people, ideal for businessmen. So again, subjective experiences of the students is also the feeling of energy. I've felt this myself. I've seen the light and felt the energy. The energy seems to be transferred from him to the students. Energy entering the body, heart or abdominal area, so you can feel it in different parts of the body. Energy circulating up the spine. Energy dissolving blocks in the free flow through the body. And energy leading to the opening of the heart. So there are 2 things, light and energy. I'm going to concentrate on light because I don't really understand the energy, and I don't know what energy is, whether it's chi or something like that, but it needs a better definition. So what are the physical features of the light? So we can now start our investigation. If you sit and watch him, attention enhances the light you see. Soft eye focus increases the brightness of the light. Now the next one is you wouldn't expect it because the light is enhanced by a brightly lit room. So I would have thought it would have been attenuated, but it isn't. It's attenuated by a double plate glazed door. It's almost abolished by complete darkness. Again, you wouldn't have thought that. And the camera shows no light around Alain. So it's got strange characteristics, some of which already start looking like a facilitation of the occipital area, or the retina, and that is that if you give light, you make the transmitted light brighter. So the reaction of students to the light and darkness, there's a marked reduction in the strength of the light, and there's a reduction in color and other phenomena. So it's almost abolished by darkness. I tried the idea of, does this light transmit? And so the obvious thing is to try FaceTime. So I tried some of his students on FaceTime when he was giving light, and it decreases by 50%. And this is a figure that we actually need to retain. And I then took some videos of him and showed them to his students who could see the light. And they said that it had gone down to about 10%. So there is something in the scale which shows that being in close touch with him, like actually seeing him, is important. And if the means of which he's represented is as a good interaction as on FaceTime, it goes down, but not completely. So the next thing to do was to ask the question of what happens when he's giving the light to himself and the student. So we did hyperscanning of Alan and the student by looking at his EEG. Hyperscanning is a new technique which is coming in and started really in 2008, and papers are being published now much more regularly. And it means that you're recording the two people at the same time. So we could ask questions about how, when the student was seeing the light, what was happening to Alan. Here you can see the laboratory in Goldsmiths. Alan is one with the back to the camera. One of his students is in the far chair. And this is the actual experimental setting. Behind the student, there will be a man which holds up a notice which Alan can see, telling him what the trial is, and there'll be one behind Alan he holds up so that the student can see. So they don't know what the trial is for the other one. We also thought that we should limit the way that the student saw Alan, and also try and limit Alan in giving the light. So we put on translucent blocking goggles. So they are translucent. You get a weak outline of what's going on, but you lose definition. So that was another trial. So what was the EEG analysis? Fairly standard, 64 channels. And we were sampling at 1 kilohertz and then downsampled for the analysis. So essentially, it was 0.6 of a hertz right up to 100 hertz. Now, the truth table of the experimental conditions was straightforward. The teacher transmitting, student receiving, teacher transmitting, student not receiving, teacher not transmitting, student receiving, teacher not transmitting, student not receiving. So we were able to look at whether the mental state of the student in any way affected whether they saw the light or not, and how did this relate, in fact, to what was happening with Alan. Now, the trials I'm going to show you are, in fact, the ones which are the teacher transmitting and the student receiving, versus trials in which he's not transmitting and the student is receiving. So it's just looking at what happens when the teacher doesn't transmit the light. And then I'm going to do something called phase slope index, which is an interesting technique just coming in. And my prediction is it will soon be flooding every psychology department there is. Now, in the power spectral density, just looking at the activity, you can see it's really very unusual. The electrode on the left shows very high gamma activity, and those of you who can't read the bottom scale, it goes up to 100 hertz. And so you can see that there is a very, very high gamma activity. And this is in the left posterior quadrant. And you can also see that there is a frontal electrode there which doesn't show it. That little peak on the left is in fact the alpha rhythm. So you can see it's absolutely enormous in relation to the rhythms which are there. So, first of all then, let's look at power spectral density. Just let's look at the distribution of frequencies over his head. And again, it's in the conditions I said. Now, there are three little cartoons here. Let's take the top one on the left. That, in fact, is labeled delta, and it's got in the rows S1, S2, that's students, and it's got columns. The column on the left is the teacher. So we're looking down on the teacher's head, and we're seeing the distribution of delta activity over his scalp. It's a sort of standard way of looking at these things. The colors just look at as regards whether or not they are highly colored, in which case they're significant. And the sort of greens like that means nothing. So in the delta, nothing very much of interest. In the theta, maybe a little bit more, but by the time you come to the alpha, which is the ones on the right, you're beginning to see an increase in the teacher's alpha activity, and a little bit in the top student, S1, who's a good student, and we included S2 because he's a bad student. So we can see exactly what being a bad student means. So we now come to the beta range, and if you look on the left-hand columns, remember, are all Alain, and you can see this huge amount of beta activity, which is spreading up from the temporal lobes, and you can see that the good student is beginning to echo this. And if you look right over at gamma 1, which is the bottom one, the teacher has now covered his cortex with gamma. It's a most interesting picture, and as it is in the gamma 2 band. So there is no doubt that his cortical function has changed remarkably when he gives light. And what does he say when he gives light? He says that he feels he goes into an energy domain and becomes multidimensional. So what conclusion of the power spectral density can we give? Beta activity is more prominent in the left posterior temporal leads, very high amplitude of gamma in this area. Gamma spreads forward at the higher frequencies. The student 1 follows the teacher more closely, and student 2 doesn't. Okay, well, can we go further than this? Yes, we could look at functional MRI, but this isn't in a hyperscanning mode. This is just a single fMRI of Alain giving the light. The fMRI paradigm contrasted light giving with mind wandering. So those were the contrasts. We chose mind wandering because it's one of the common meditative controls. The aim was to compare light giving with known changes during meditation. We anticipated that the default mode network would be attenuated light giving as compared to mind wandering. In other words, that this was going to be a sort of meditation technique. We were also expecting increased activity in a posterior temporal and fusiform gyrus, and this we argued from the power spectral analysis. Well, there are three cartoons here. The one on the left shows cerebellar activity. The one in the middle shows shows the post-central gyrus, and the one on the right shows activity in the left temporal lobe. So we know that he's got increased flow in these places. What we'll have to do is try and make some picture of it. But first of all, we need to look at connectivity between the student and Alain. And so, do their brains drive each other or not? Now, this is an interesting question, because remember that some of the students do, in fact, expand not only their experience of the light, but also develop other capacities. Well, you can't use correlation because you can't get causation. So any correlative technique is not going to work. Now, the arrow of time is important. And in fact, although you can talk about the past causing the present. You can't talk about the future causing the past. And the interesting point is that if you predict signal X by information of past values of X, that's straight, absolutely clear. And if you try again and predict signal X by information of past values of X and past values of Y, then that means that past Y has a causative influence on signal X. So this is essentially what we're doing. Now, there are three methods to do this. One is called Granger causality. The next is called phase slope index, which is what we use. The last one is called mutual information. Mutual information is extremely good. I've used that before with some of our MEG work that we did, and it gives, in fact, causation and time. Granger causality, in fact, is particularly bad if you have noisy signals, as we do in the EEG. So we didn't use that, but we do use phase slope index. And I would recommend that people go to this paper in 2008, where the authors said, we recently proposed a new measure termed phase slope index. It estimates the causal direction of interaction robustly with respect to the instantaneous mixture of independent sources. So it's a perfectly valid technique to look at a series of channels, and so that's what we used. If you do the stats with a phase slope index, it's much better than Granger causality. So this is based on the concept that there is a non-vanishing imaginary part of the coherence. So BSI, phase slope index, detects non-instantaneous changes. In short, PSI measures connectivity between two signals based on the slope of the phase of their spectrum. So let's then look at what we did. 3 steps. For each frequency band, find the frequency corresponding to the largest PSI. Simple. Plot head-in-head connectivity, which I'll explain, between all the electrodes of the teacher against all the electrodes of the student. And on the head plots, you will see that when there is red, the teacher is driving the student's brain, and when there is blue, the student is driving the teacher's brain. So is there some sort of relation like that between them? So we looked at the various bands, and we calculated the phase slope index between all pairwise electrodes, intrabrain and interbrain, in the following frequency bands, and the bands are fairly standard. So here's our head-on-head plot. You see a circle there, and in it, it's made up of little circles. You're looking down on the head again. You can see the front of the head at the top of the slide under PSI, back at the back, and left and right. And I've taken one circle out to show you that this is the PSI values with other electrodes. And so it contains a lot of information, but I think the best way to look at it is take it that if there are a lot of blue colors there, then the student is driving the teacher, and if they're red colors, the teacher is driving the student. So we show the PSI linkages between the teacher and the subject on the electrode diagrams. We then transform the electrode placements into a cortical map by using a reference map, which I will explain. Phase slope index is, in fact, extremely good and tolerant of volume currents, otherwise you couldn't do that. So there are 2 things. We have some idea of the picture of the energy or blood flow in the brain in the fMRI, and we're doing this to see exactly what happens where the electrodes are placed. And as I say, you couldn't do this if it wasn't tolerant of volume currents. Now, if we look at what we found, there was, in the different frequency bands, we found that the students were driving the teacher, That's the 1 hertz and the 29 hertz. And we found that in the 10 hertz, 44 hertz, and 60 hertz range, the teacher was driving the student. So what does that mean? Let's look at the teacher first and what he did. This is the electrode plot. We're now looking down on the head. Those are the 68 electrodes of the teacher on the left and the student on the right. And you can see that it's now turned on its side because the blue triangle is the nose of the student and the red triangle is the nose of the teacher. And so we look at the relationship between the teacher and the student. And you can see straight away some very interesting things. The whole back of the teacher's head is red. And he, in fact, from many different areas, is controlling the student's brain. And what we've done is I've done the plot as I showed you, and most of this activity is going towards the post-central gyrus. So here is a map. So this is one of the areas that the teacher is interested in stimulating. Next, remember that we tried the trial with the goggles on. My prediction was that this would markedly affect any connection between the student and the teacher. And there is the head-on-head plot at 10 hertz. You can see all the colors are, in fact, very green, and there is no connection. So the goggles stop the connection. Next, we looked at 44 hertz, a teacher and student. Again, you can see not so much area, a lot coming from the left of the teacher. And if we look at the map, you can see, in fact, that it is the somatosensory association cortex, the angular gyrus, and the visual areas of the student that the teacher appears to be connecting with. And if we put the goggles in, it goes. Then again, for the last one, for the teacher, 66 hertz, you can see that there is a cross change in modality, right of the student, of the teacher to left of the student. And if we look at the areas, it's things like the fusiform gyrus, the angular gyrus, and the cortex. So he's really interested in the back of the head. But interestingly enough, in the high gamma range, there is occasionally some connectivity maintained even when you're wearing the goggles. So if we look at this, are the areas driven by the teacher. They relate right, that's with the goggles. And these are the areas driven by the teacher. The post-central gyrus, the association areas, angular gyrus, fusiform gyrus, and the visual area. Remember, the fusiform gyrus is where colors are looked at. And the angular gyrus is very much a calculation on the left, but it's also a multimodal area, as is the association area above. So we're looking at main areas of association. The student also drives the teacher's brain, and he does it in two ways. One at 35 hertz, one at 1 hertz, so very slow, and most of the activity is in the front of the student's brain. So if we go to the map, you can see that two new areas have occurred, area 10 and area 8. Area 8 is the eye movement one, and area 10 is the prefrontal gyrus. And this, of course, is an executive function area. And the eye movement area is also important, but it's also a multimodal area. And you also have the post-central gyrus, as you saw. Goggles remove it. And if you look at 29 hertz, then it's much more spread out on the student's brain. And he's driving, again, an interesting area. You can see area 10 is coming up, area 8 doesn't, but the other areas at the back do come up. So it's all fairly understandable. If you look at the goggles, again, everything goes. So, communication of slower frequencies by the student, its coupling with the front of the brain regions as well as the more posterior ones that the teacher couples with. So in summary, these are the areas driven by the teacher, which we've said, and these are the areas driven by the student, and what interests me is the more frontal driving of the student's brain, of the teacher's brain by the students. The student, apart from the goggles, the student is not receiving, and the teacher is, yes, the goggles remove it, but what we can do is we can look very quickly at the other conditions when we change the mental state. The columns show the height of the PSI index, and as you go through the various mental states of the teacher transmitting, etc., it decreases, and right at the end of that on the right are the goggles. They're the lowest PSI connection. In the other conditions, you can see there is a varying amount of PSI contact in the gamma band. So when light energy is being given, by the teacher to his student, there is marked linking at different frequencies of the two brains. Different subjects linked at different frequencies. Most brain linkage is removed by looking through goggles, and the transfer of light energy is in part through the visual spectrum. So, conclusion of that, it's not transfer of visual photons because it's not visible to a camera. It's enhanced by light, reduced by darkness, the linkage is reduced by goggles, and there's a learning appears to be important. And it looks as if the visual structures are stimulated by the student, by the teacher. Now, some of you may have gone to Eric Virey's presentation, and he showed that in fact visual photons were released, although it was at very low levels, and it could be, and these could be but it is possible that perhaps there are mechanisms which enhance visual photons. And Stuart very kindly sent me some work which points out to retinal cilia. And the question is whether in these are in fact wave guides. Or could it be the eyes and face? And there are a number of papers which suggest that this may be what is important with hyperscanning changes, although it hasn't been done to this degree. So there is also the energy, which I don't really understand, and I think this requires more work. So the teacher says that when giving light, he's multidimensional. Is this linkage simply restricted to that very special state, or is it a general property of the mind-to-mind communication? Because if it is, then it's enormously important, because you can see straight away that if you look at ordinary teachers in ordinary schools with their pupils, you'll begin to see what the communication between teacher and pupil is. And so we should start getting a very good understanding of social communication. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Professor Joy Deep, Caroline, and Eleanor, who helped with the study. So thank you all very much indeed, and thank you for your attention.